Hi there. Welcome to number 4. We're in the Apologetics series, and we're just going to have a look now. I'm going to share my screen with you so that we can continue our studies in the area of apologetics. So just excuse me while I bring up the screen. Take that one, and we'll remind ourselves where we were. Hit that button. Great technology. Thanks for coming back again. This is lecture number 4, and we're going to move on. We've had a look at the concept of the first cause of the universe, the fact that every event has a cause. Therefore, because the beginning of the universe was an event, it must have had a cause. And because that cause is not part of this current universe, cannot be part of this current universe, it must have been beyond this current universe. So that opens up the whole concept of other dimensions, and particularly the dimension of eternity. The concept of dimensions is quite popular in the last couple of decades as scientists recognize as things that they cannot explain just in terms of our time-space dimension. And so they speculate. And it's, of course, it's speculation because nobody can go into these dimensions, no matter how many, doesn't really matter how many there are. There may be a number, there may be none, but nobody can go into them. But from a biblical perspective, we believe in the dimension of eternity, which is not a created dimension, but a dimension that exists independently in and of itself. We want to move on now from the first cause and the concept of design that we've looked at, and the fine-tuning of the universe that we've also looked at. Now, sometimes an argument arises on fine-tuning. Yes, but look, there are so many, there's a possibility that there have been millions of universes over time, and so maybe this is the one that got lucky, and here we are. But the reality is that time doesn't actually exist independently of a universe. So the whole concept is not necessarily the same. And the other point about this is that it doesn't solve the basic problem of explaining where everything came from. So without a being that has got the explanatory power to give a universe like ours, it doesn't make sense. So I maintain that atheism does not make sense. So let's move on to another argument that Christians often use, and this is the argument of conscience and morals, which are related. From a conscience perspective, I think we could argue that wherever you go around the world, there are people that have moral codes. The people know some things are right and some things are wrong. And there are variations, of course, and in some cultures there's some weird variations, like cultures that think that's a really positive thing to deceive somebody and to rip them off. But most cultures have an ethic that says it's good to worship the deity and it's good to treat other people with respect. And that's found right around the world, whatever deity you tend to belong to. And the argument is, well, if all cultures have a similar ethic, if all individuals have a similar ethic, that's something that surely is wired into them. And of course, you don't have a moral code without a moral code giver. Therefore, that moral code giver is God, is the creator. Now, evolutionists will argue, no. This is an evolutionary concept. Kindness, altruism, we call it. It can be explained because it helps a community to increase its genetic spreading, its own genes, and and it gives an advantage over other genetic types, and therefore it is a positive thing. But the reality of human nature argues against that, because people have an inner bent to be self-centered, and to argue that somebody who's in a primitive culture decides that it's a good thing to be kind from an evolutionary perspective, because their genes want to propagate more. Those that argue these things, they kind of give genes a personality, as if like Dawkins, so if they were controlled by our genes, like they're an intelligent personality, and our genes are driving to be more, to flourish, and therefore we evolve. Whereas the genes of themselves don't have any personality at all, or wisdom to make decisions. They're just part of our biological system. The other thing is that this argument does not solve the ultimate problem, which is, where did everything come from? And therefore, it doesn't give us satisfactory answers from an atheistic perspective. So the other aspect of the moral argument has to do with this concept of a lawgiver, and it was kind of expressed by C.S. Lewis. This is the man, and a great scholar, a British author and lecturer, and wrote some wonderful literature. And he said this. He said, and I believe this is from Mere Christianity. He said, if no set of moral ideas were truer or better than any other, there would be no sense in preferring civilized morality to Nazi morality. The moment you say that one set of moral ideas is truer or better than another, you're in fact measuring them both by a standard, saying that one of them conforms to that standard more clearly than the other. So what he's saying is when you say something's better than another, what are you measuring them by? Now, as Christians, we've got an adequate standard, an adequate philosophical standard for ethics, for morality. As a Christian, my morality has this basis: God's character and God's plan for my life. And God's character is ultimately one of good, compassion, kindness, mercy. Those are predominant characteristics of God. His purpose for me is described, is summarized by Jesus in two words, two concepts. One, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And secondly, love others. So if I don't particularly like somebody and throw a brick at their head, was that good or was that bad? The answer is that was bad, because compared to the standard of God's character and God's purposes for my life on this earth, it contravened them. Therefore, it is bad. So we have got a standard to measure by. Now, the atheist doesn't have an adequate philosophical standard for making moral decisions, because if there is no God, there is no ultimate reality, if there is no ultimate judge, if there's no ultimate decider as to what's good and what's bad, then they become the arbiter of their own behavior. So they decide what's good and what's bad. They decide what they want to do. And if they've got more guns or more muscles than somebody else, well, what they have got rules. And so morality becomes a question of personal preference. And so there is no adequate philosophical argument for morality and for ultimate morality apart from God. Now, an example of this is sometimes used as what apparently was used at the trials of the Nazis, the Nuremberg trials in Germany at the end of the war, Second World War. And apparently the Nazis' lawyers, defense lawyers, came up with quite a clever argument. Basically, it was, look, okay, in your country, America and your allies, in your country, it was wrong to execute people for being Jewish or Polish or whatever, or gypsies or homosexuals or whatever. In your country, these things were not acceptable, but in our country, our leaders made laws to say that this was okay, that eugenics was okay, that we can use humans for experimentation. That's okay, and that's a clever argument. And what the judges had to do is to appeal to a higher authority, and whether that authority is God or whether they suppose some universal law of human rights, they appealed to a higher authority and judged these guys as guilty, of course, and a number of them were executed. A universal law of human rights doesn't actually have any validity unless there is a higher ultimate authority that gives those rights. One of the things about being made in the image of God means that we have a dignity, that we have a value. And our value, while other animals and creatures are very valuable, our value is greater. And because we have a dignity, and therefore human life is sacred. Therefore, to take human life is wrong, if it's innocent human life. And to help humanity is good. So we have a foundation for human rights. Atheists simply do not. They borrow our ethics. They borrow our foundation. Humanists have done this traditionally. They've borrowed the foundations of Christianity so that they have a basis for looking after people and doing good as against doing evil. So this is a good argument, the fact that there are human rights, that there is a morality, that something inside us recognizes the importance of an ultimate judge, of an ultimate lawgiver, that there is actually an ultimate lawgiver there. Society works far better when it's there than when it's not. Another thing about God's existence is that it's an explanation about what life is. Now, as human beings, we're made up of a whole lot of chemicals put together, and but there's something else, and when that something else goes, our body dies. Now, some argue that the soul, if we want to call it the soul, actually has some sort of influence on gravity, because I've heard it in the Reader's Digest years ago, and I'd like to see the experiment carried out for some reasons, not to be there, that when a person dies, they actually lose a small amount of weight. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but there is a reality about humanity, about beings, that when it's gone, the body dies. What is this concept called life? And the Bible teaches that this is something God endows us with when we come into the world. We have this experience of life and knowledge. He lights up everyone who comes into the world. And so the spiritual explanation seems to be the best explanation of this. The other thing is that the Bible, the Christian concept of God and of his designing and creating the cosmos, and his designing and creating humanity, but is also designing and creating of another estate or dimension where the spiritual realm, the created spiritual realm, has its existence. And that this spiritual realm can interplay with our spiritual realm. And the way I like to think about this, which I think is helpful, is when you're sitting there watching your television set, and let's just say the TV is tuned to channel 1, and you can see channel 1 and you're watching channel 1, and then somebody comes along and hits the button and it changes to channel 2. Now, channel 1 is still all around you, but you've just tuned into channel 2. And this is kind of like the difference between the spirit realm, which is very real. Now, we don't see it very blatantly real in the Western world, but we're in the East and in other cultures where there's a lot of witchcraft, a lot of occult activity, Brazil, India, there's a lot of demon gods, where there's fire walking, and where there's a whole lot of other stuff like this. And in Africa, where there's very idolatrous religions, spirit-based religions, there is a whole lot of stuff that genuinely happens. You cannot just explain this away. It's not just myths. It's not just the mind. When a person gets themselves under the spiritual control of a spiritual entity through all their chanting and procedures, and they're able to walk on red hot coals without their feet being burnt, that defies the laws of nature, particularly the burning and non-burning at a particular temperature laws of nature. Something's going on there. And these mysteries are best understood by the fact that God did create the spirit realm, and in that spirit realm is benevolent spiritual activity, which is God and God's servants, spiritual servants that we sometimes call angels. But there's also the dark side, and which is rebellious to our Creator and does an awful lot of stuff to try to enslave people and to fear and to destroy humanity. So the spiritual answer is the best answer. These things cannot be just all explained away by psychological quirks. Another evidence for God's existence is miracles. Now, it's interesting that the early Christians, in their preaching of the gospel, the miracle that they most talked about, as I can see it, is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And certain things that God can do, others can mimic. If you look way back at the Exodus, and you'll find that Moses would do something as a sign from God, and these Egyptian occultists could do similar stuff. And so the spirit realm can do limited spiritual activity. But life and death are in the hands of the Lord. And a spiritual being, a demon, may animate a corpse. And in some cultures, zombieism is a known thing. But it can't bring a human being back to life. That is a God-sized miracle. The miracle of Jesus were real, and they were miracles which convinced his disciples that he was the Son of God. And that's what they were for. Apart from helping people as well, they were demonstrations of who Jesus is, and they were also samples and teaching points about what the world will be like when Jesus comes and reigns in his fullness in his kingdom. It's going to be a very, very different, wonderful, wonderful world. Now, so these miracles were done by Jesus. The resurrection, the thing about the miracles of Jesus is that even his enemies acknowledged that he did miracles. When he raised Lazarus from the dead, that was like the last straw. And they didn't argue that Lazarus was raised from the dead. The guy was alive. He'd been in the grave 4 days, and he was alive. And so Jesus, I guess, saved this last miracle till last, because he perhaps knew that it would have known that it was going to be the tipping point. It was going to be the end of the journey, really, because people were believing in him left, right, and center, and the Jewish leaders had to either acknowledge his deity and his messiahship, and repent and follow him, or they had to get rid of him. And we know the rest is history, literally. So, but the miracle of the resurrection of Christ is really an important one, and because that's a God-sized miracle, and you can't have a God-sized miracle without God. And so this is an evidence that God exists. If Jesus got raised from the dead, God exists. End of story. So these These evidences, some of them are stronger than others, but as a whole, they form a pretty impressive set of data to show us that God does, in fact, exist. Now, we acknowledge there's a mystery in God, okay? God is mysterious in his being and his activity because he's beyond our limited understanding. But we live with mysteries every day. You know, I understand gravity might be partly still a mystery. It gets me down. And maybe lightning, all that's a bit of a mystery still. And some think that maybe gravity operates through other dimensions. But there are mysteries. Light was a mystery when I was at university. How could it be waves and particles at the same time? Because these things are different. Quantum theory is pretty mysterious, but it's real. So we have mysteries, and sometimes we discover the answers to those mysteries. It's one of the things that keeps science going. Human investigation, trying to discover the answers to mysteries. But we have to acknowledge that God himself must be mysterious because he's so much greater than us. We'll never fully know or understand him. This causes some people to turn off God. I've got an old lady, I know, my mate's mother, and she said, Lewis, when I see God, I'm going to have a few things to say to him. And in a way, I can understand where she's coming from because, you know, there's a lot about her life that hasn't turned out ideally, and some of it, of course, was her own doing. And one of the big questions people have is, you know, why does God allow the amount of freedom he does? Why doesn't he stop, you know, the pedophiles and the mass murderers and all this stuff? And why does he allow that if he's a good God? And I can sympathize with that question. It's an understandable one. But in the end, who am I until I've created a universe as magnificent as this one? Who am I that thinks I should have the right to call my creator to account for the level of freedom that he allows at this particular time in history in the world? How dare I pitch my wisdom against his when his wisdom has been so clearly demonstrated in nature? So we've got to wind our neck in a little bit, pull our heads in, and humble ourselves and acknowledge that even though I don't understand God, I'll give him the credit for being a lot wiser than I am. Now, the corollary of the fact that God exists is, I think, logically, that God is knowable. And this point really draws a distinction between theism, that God exists as an independent entity, independent of what he created, and pantheism, where God and creation are the same. Because the pantheistic concept of deity is not knowable. But God is presented in the Bible as an intelligent being. Now, let me just help you through the way I see this logic. God made us, and the maker of something must always be, by definition, greater than the something that is made. So mankind will never make a machine which is greater than mankind. They might make a machine that's stronger. They might make a machine that can do stuff faster, but it'll never be ultimately greater. And so that means that if the creator is greater than the creation, then God must be greater than us. Now, God has created us with personalities and relational ability. Therefore, God himself must be a greater personality and have greater relational ability. Therefore, God must be able to communicate to us in a way that we can understand. And so the pantheistic concept of God is non-personal, essentially. And being non-personal can't communicate to us in a relationship way. It's more of a non-personal, mystical unity. And so, therefore, God is knowable. So we would expect, because God is also love, and God wants us to have the best life, that part of his provision for us, because he is a providing God, he's provided air and he's given us lungs to breathe it. He's provided food and he's given us a stomach to digest it. He's provided us a mind that asks deep and philosophical questions. It seems reasonable logically that the God who is the provider, clearly, would also provide with us the information that we need to have the main questions of life answered and to flourish in life, and to know the rules, to know how life best works. And so the fact that God communicates should not be a surprise to us. The fact that God communicates in nature, this is what we call in theology general revelation. He reveals a whole lot about himself in nature. In Romans chapter 1, it talks about his essential nature that is revealed to us in what he created. You can tell a lot about a painter by what they paint. You can tell a lot about a person by what they create. You can tell a lot about an author by what they write. You can tell a lot about God by what he made and the way he made things to operate. You can see love in the creation, see power in the creation. His characteristics are seen there, a lot of them. It also shouldn't surprise us that once in the development of the human race, written language became part of the scenario, that God would reveal to us more specifically what we need to know in a written format, in a way that was reliable and could seem to be tested along the way. Quality control, quality tested. Now, this is what we have in the Bible. God communicates to us. We call this in theology specific or particular revelation, where God is provided using human agency through prophets and apostles. He has provided for us what he wants us to know. And because it's historical in its perspective, it starts from the beginning and it moves on. And because it's honest about the realities of human life and history, it shows us that this is field tested. That when God's principles are obeyed, humans flourish, society flourishes. When they are rejected, society turns to chaos and is destroyed. So that lesson comes through again and again in the Bible. You can see it in the book of Judges, particularly. They lived by God's laws. They drifted from God's laws. Their society was destroyed. They turned back to God's laws. They prospered. And they went through that again and again. So God, logically, is a person, because he's created lesser persons, and that's us. He's knowable because he's created us to be in relationship, and he's greater than we are. So God exists. This is the foundation of our thinking. God exists as a person and is knowable, and God communicates through creation. We're going to move on to the next question, the next of the big three questions in apologetics. Is the Bible true? And does it show the evidence of being provided for us by God? As I've said, we shouldn't be surprised that God has communicated through literature in a reliable way. So is this in fact the case? Let's have a look at this. First of all, Dave Hunt makes an interesting quote here in his book, Is the Bible Reliable? The Bible was without doubt the most remarkable as well as the most controversial book in the world. Its claim to be inspired of God has caused those who don't believe in God and those who follow rival religions to attack its credibility. In fact, it has been attacked by determined skeptics and professional critics for centuries as no other book in history. In every instance, however, when the facts have been established through archaeological findings, the Bible has been proven correct and its critics wrong. This has been the case 100% of the time, as it would have to be if the Bible is indeed God's word. And so it shouldn't surprise us that the Bible's been attacked. But the reality is that, according to Dave Hunt, it shows itself to be correct. And we'll be looking at archaeology in a bit more detail in a little while. The first question we're going to ask is, have we got all of the evidence there is in archaeology? And the common sense answer clearly is, no, we don't. But in particular, a lot of the archaeology that we have interest in is in Israel itself. There's others in other places, but a lot of it has to do with Israel. And Randall Price in The Stones Cry Out says less than 2% of the surveyed sites in Israel have been excavated. The rest of that will be in your notes if you're interested. Of the known 500,000 cuneiform texts left in museum storage, only about a fraction, only about 10% have ever been published. Now, cuneiform is a form of writing by using little wedgie type things and impressing shapes into clay and then drying the clay or baking the clay, and a fairly cumbersome way of storing stuff. A lot easier on a flash drive or on the cloud. But that's the way they did it initially, and it's only about 10%. So there's plenty more stuff out there. Is the Bible true history? One of the interesting things that happened a number of decades ago in Christianity is that a scientist, or a theologian really, kind of, in Germany by the name of Julian Wellhausen, he postulated a theory that the first 5 books of the Bible that Jesus attributes to Moses, it cannot have been written by Moses because they didn't have language in Moses' time. And this produced something called the documentary hypothesis. And a lot of Bible seminaries, some of them Bible cemeteries, in my opinion, trotted this out as if it were fact. And a lot of people training for the ministry bought into it. And of course, it sold short the word of God. Now, it's interesting that his argument, I guess, that there wasn't written language during Moses's time, was possibly based on an evolutionary perspective, that, early man was running around in garments made of skins and clubs and living in caves and all pretty primitive. And that's a picture a lot of people have got because of evolution. It's an utterly false picture. The evidence of archaeology shows that there's been tremendous technology in the ancient world. Not electronic technology generally, although the ancient Egyptians did have an electroplating kind of industry. But nothing as sophisticated as what we've got now, but nonetheless, just amazing technology. I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff people did in those days that we can only guess at how they actually achieved these things. I mean, the pyramids, for a start. So, but anyway, people bought into this nonsense, and its ideas that the documents were later, and so that maybe the Israelites invented their own history to give themselves a right to be in the land later on. And but then archaeology came to bear fruit. And one of the things that they found was the black stele. And this is a very famous piece of archaeology. See, it's got writing on it, as well as carving. And these are the laws of Hammurabi. They're very famous. Some believe the Bible was based on these laws, but I rather believe that the other way around. But what this showed is that this thing goes back to 3 centuries before Moses, 300 years. So handwritten language and sophisticated social activity was very much part of the world at the time of Moses, in fact, 300 years before it. So there's some of the writing, and my ancient Sumerian is a bit rusty, so I'll just ask you to take my word for it. And then another archaeological find, which was really important, was what's called the Rosetta Stone. You can see this in the British Museum. One of the big challenges of archaeologists, of course, is how do we read these ancient languages that nobody speaks anymore? Now, we read Greek, and we knew how to read Greek. And then they found the Rosetta Stone. And the Rosetta Stone had the same message in 3 different languages. And so the Greek was at the bottom. So Greek scholars could read Greek, no problem. Ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics were at the top, and people didn't know how to read them. The other one in the middle is a Demotic Egyptian text. So it's not the ancient hieroglyphs, it's a more modern Egyptian language. And so these 3 were all on the same piece of stone for people to read. Now that gave us the clues to how to decipher the hieroglyphic language, the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. And a bit of a problem for Mormons, because one of the books in the Mormon series, and I've forgotten whether it's the Doctrine and Covenants or the Pearl of Great Price, is the Book of Abraham. Joseph Smith got a scroll, an ancient papyrus that he bought, and claimed that it was the Book of Abraham. He translated it to be the Book of Abraham. And of course, people didn't know. He claimed it was Reformed Egyptian. Nobody ever knew about a language called Reformed Egyptian. But now, of course, that we can speak, we can read hieroglyphs, we know what the book says, and it's actually a series of instructions about burying dead people. It's nothing at all like Joseph Smith translated it to be. That ought to be a warning to Mormons, but sadly, so many of them are seriously gullible and naive. I have written a book called Great News for Mormons, if you're interested. Okay, well, let's talk about the first section as Genesis, genuine history. In fact, I think we'll take a break here, and I think we'll come back and we'll start our way through the Bible in the next session. That'll be session number 5. So I'll stop sharing now, and I'll bid you farewell. And I'll look forward to you seeing me, at least, even though I'm not that gorgeous, in the next session, which will be Apologetics 5. God bless you. Stay well.